Chief Justice John Roberts walked into that hearing thinking he'd seen it all, until Jasmine Crockett turned his own words against him and left the room speechless. There was a stillness in room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that comes just before something sharp cuts through the air. On paper, it was just another hearing, but everyone in that room could feel it. Something was about to happen. Chief Justice John Roberts sat at the witness table in a navy suit that looked like it cost more than a month's salary for most people in that room. He was composed, collected, and some would say confident to a fault. This wasn't his first rodeo. He'd testified before Congress several times, and he knew how to play the game, speak just enough, control the tempo, stay above the fray. This particular hearing, though, was different. It wasn't about broad constitutional theory, it was about something that made even the most seasoned justices squirm: judicial ethics. There had been growing pressure in the public eye, questions about impartiality, about gifts, about connections that never quite made it into disclosures. People were watching, cameras were rolling, and this time, there was no shield of the robe. The committee members took their turns. Some lobbed softballs, others tried to strike a careful balance, not too accusatory, not too weak. And then, when it was finally her turn, there was a pause. A name was read into the record: Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. She adjusted the mic and leaned forward slightly. Her voice didn't need to rise, her tone already demanded attention. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said. Some people in the room weren't paying much attention. They'd heard of her, sure, a former public defender, relatively new to Congress, always sharp-tongued during floor debates, known for calling things as she saw them. But this was a different arena, and she was sitting across from the highest judicial authority in the country. You could almost see the unspoken bets being placed around the room. How long could she hold her own? Justice Roberts didn't flinch. He gave her the kind of smile that only powerful men learn to master, a mix of patience and pretense, like he was entertaining a question from a bright student. But Crockett wasn't looking for validation, she was here to hold him accountable. "Chief Justice," she began, "you've said in past statements that the court follows a strict standard of ethical conduct, even in the absence of an official code. Is that correct?" Roberts clasped his hands together, his voice calm. "That is correct, Congresswoman. The members of the court adhere to principles that have long guided judicial behavior." She nodded, flipping a page in her folder. "So, help me understand. If that's the case, why was there no disclosure about the relationship between Justice Merritt and a political donor whose case came before the court just last year?" That got attention. Cameras clicked, a few heads in the room turned. Roberts didn't smile this time. He adjusted his tie slightly. "I'm not at liberty to comment on ongoing ethical reviews or specifics related to individual justices." "Right," Crockett said, looking down briefly, then back up. "But you can speak on precedent, correct?" "Yes." "Great," she said, "because, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Supreme Court has historically used the appearance of impropriety as a benchmark. It's not just about whether something is technically wrong, it's about whether the public has reason to believe something might be." Roberts shifted just slightly. "The appearance standard has guided many institutions, yes." Crockett didn't wait. "Then wouldn't failing to disclose a close relationship with someone who financially benefits from a court's decision look improper?" She didn't yell, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The room was already quiet. Roberts was still composed, but the game had shifted. He answered carefully. "Congresswoman, I believe we're getting into hypotheticals." "I'm not. I'm quoting facts from your own court's financial records." The temperature in the room hadn't even reached its peak yet, that moment was still coming. Roberts straightened in his chair, one hand resting on the mahogany table. His eyes, cool and practiced, scanned Crockett's expression, but she didn't blink. Her gaze stayed fixed, and her voice remained even. "I'm quoting directly from the disclosure forms, Chief Justice," she said again, slower this time, as if daring him to challenge the source. He cleared his throat. "Those forms are compiled by the court's administrative office, and I trust the process is followed with care." "But do you review them?" she asked, head tilted slightly. "Do you personally make sure what's submitted is transparent and truthful?" The pause was brief but telling. "There is a system in place," he replied. "Each justice is responsible for their own disclosures." Crockett sat back in her chair. She didn't smile, this wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, she let the silence do the work for her. "Interesting," she said, "because where I come from, if you're responsible for your own oversight, you're not being held accountable. You're just checking your own work." A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. One staffer let out a barely audible exhale through their nose, half laugh, half disbelief. Roberts tried to redirect. "Respectfully, Congresswoman, the judiciary was designed to function independently of the legislative and executive branches. Our role is to interpret the law, not to be governed by political pressure." "And no one here is trying to do that," Crockett replied. "We're trying to understand why certain patterns keep showing up and why they keep going unchecked." Roberts opened his mouth, but she held up a hand, not to interrupt but to frame her next question. "I spent years in criminal courtrooms across Texas, watching judges lecture young men, black, brown, white, didn't matter, about taking responsibility, about how even the appearance of dishonesty could ruin their lives. So, forgive me if I don't buy that the nation's highest court can't be held to a similar standard." Roberts shifted his posture again, ever so slightly. "Congresswoman, I do understand your point, but we have always taken concerns seriously and responded with internal review and integrity." "You have no binding code," Crockett cut in, "and the only review comes from inside the House." A beat. "That's like asking a fox to file a security report on the henhouse." This time, there was a low murmur in the back of the room. Cameras clicked faster, reporters leaned forward in their chairs. She wasn't grandstanding, she was pinning him down. Roberts inhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Still composed, but his answers now had the tone of someone who realized he was on thinner ice than he expected. "The court is not above criticism," he said, "but I would remind the Congresswoman that respect between co-equal branches is essential." Crockett looked down, then back up, the briefest flicker of frustration crossing her face, not because she was losing, but because she knew that word respect was being used to deflect. "I respect the court," she said. "I respect what it should be. But respect without honesty is just decoration, and the people who elected me didn't send me here to admire your robe. They sent me here to ask why the rules seem different depending on who wears the robe." Roberts looked at her longer this time. The shift was subtle, but it was there. He wasn't looking at a freshman congresswoman anymore, he was looking at someone who had come prepared to knock down every wall of technicality he tried to stand behind. But she was only warming up. The real hit was coming next, and this time it wouldn't be rhetorical. The next set of papers in Jasmine Crockett's folder didn't look like much, thin, barely more than a few stapled pages. But they had weight, not the kind that made noise when dropped, but the kind that made people stop talking. She slid one page forward on the desk in front of her and adjusted the mic. "Chief Justice, are you familiar with Dalton versus Mason County, decided in the Fifth Circuit in 2009? Roberts squinted for a second, not out of confusion but calculation. "Vaguely. That was a procedural ruling involving judicial recusal, if I'm not mistaken." "You're not," Crockett replied. "It involved a judge who failed to recuse himself despite having indirect financial ties to one of the law firms involved in the case. The ruling made it clear, appearance alone was grounds for removal." She tapped the edge of the page. "And yet, just last year, Justice Harlan participated in Macon versus Delta Rail, a case where his longtime friend and financial backer stood to gain significantly from the ruling." Roberts didn't respond right away. Crockett leaned forward slightly. "No recusal, no explanation, no transparency, and the decision came down 5-4. This wasn't just a call-out, it was a scalpel to the soft tissue of the court's defense." Roberts exhaled slowly. "Congresswoman, I'm not here to litigate individual cases." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I'm asking you how a court built on the principle of fairness expects the American people to keep faith when its decisions read more like backroom deals than balanced judgment." A few gasps, not loud, but real. One staffer's pen slipped off the table and clattered to the floor. Roberts leaned into the mic. "Your language is inflammatory. And your silence," Crockett said calmly, "has been even worse." She didn't rush. She let the weight of each phrase settle before continuing. There's a woman named Carla Jennings in my district, a single mother, worked nights at a hospital for 20 years. Her son was denied financial aid because of a clerical mistake that left her looking like she owed back taxes. She appealed all the way up to a federal court and was told, in so many words, tough luck. She paused, looking directly at Roberts. But a billionaire with private ties to a sitting justice can get their case heard, argued, and ruled in less than 4 months with favorable results. Roberts's eyes narrowed slightly, his hands now folded a little too tightly. He hadn't expected this kind of preparation, certainly not from her. The court, he said, operates with limited resources and must make difficult decisions about which cases it takes. That does not imply favoritism. But perception matters, doesn't it? She asked. He didn't respond. She asked again, Chief Justice, does perception matter? He nodded quietly. Of course. Crockett's voice dropped half a register. Then I suggest you start caring a little more about what the people are seeing, because right now, they're not seeing justice. They're seeing power protecting itself. For the first time, Roberts didn't have a counter. The room was still. Even the committee chair didn't interject. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was starting to feel like something historic. And Crockett, she wasn't even raising her voice. She flipped another page. I came here today with respect, but I also came with facts. And the facts say your institution has a problem, a deep one, and it's time someone stopped pretending otherwise. But the true shift hadn't happened yet, not until the Chief Justice realized who he was actually sitting across from. The subtle shift in Chief Justice Roberts's tone wasn't lost on anyone. He leaned forward just slightly, clasping his hands in a way that tried to reassert composure, but the rhythm of his voice had changed. Less measured, less certain. Congresswoman, he began, while I understand your passion, I would caution against drawing conclusions from isolated incidents without a full understanding of judicial process. Crockett didn't even blink. With all due respect, Chief Justice, I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm drawing connections. There's a difference. She could feel it, the moment the floor started tipping. The eyes in the room weren't watching Roberts anymore, they were watching her. And that's when she made her next move. In 2013, she said, holding up another document, you gave a commencement speech at Harvard Law. You told graduates that, and I quote, your credibility is your currency. You said the moment people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses. Roberts leaned back. That's correct. Then tell me, she said, her voice sharper now, how does credibility survive when public trust in your institution is at its lowest in decades, when polls show that more Americans believe the court is driven by politics than by principle? He didn't answer immediately. She pressed further. You don't get to spend 20 years building a reputation and then act surprised when the silence around your colleagues starts cracking it open. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett didn't wait this time. You called this passion. It's not. It's precision. I'm not yelling, I'm not speculating. I'm asking why Americans like Carla Jennings are held to standards your justices can ignore in plain sight. She shifted her tone lower, firmer. Do you know what it's like to walk into a courtroom knowing the scales are tilted before you even speak? I do. I've watched young men cry after being sentenced because they knew they never had a real shot, because justice was never about truth. It was about who had access, who had ties, who had time. The silence in the room grew dense, no clicks, no whispers, just Crockett's voice carrying every word like a stone thrown through glass. Roberts tried to recover. The court has taken steps. Not enough, she cut him off. Not when billionaires fly justices to private resorts and no one blinks. Not when you write decisions that impact millions from behind doors no one can knock on. And then she said it, you're right about one thing. Credibility is currency, and right now, your institution is in overdraft. That line hit harder than anything she'd said all morning. One law clerk in the back scribbled it down so fast the pen almost tore through the page. For the first time, Roberts didn't reach for a rebuttal. He just sat still. Crockett let the silence hold for 2 long beats before she leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of everything she'd said hang in the air. She wasn't showing off, she wasn't performing. She was doing what no one else had dared, calling the court's power what it had become: insulated, selective, untouchable. Robert smoothed out his tie again, but the motion felt more like a nervous tic than a display of confidence. The committee chair cleared his throat, ready to move on, but even he paused, maybe out of respect, maybe because he didn't know how to follow what just happened. But Crockett wasn't finished yet, not until the American people were part of this conversation too. Crockett wasn't interested in just sparring with a Supreme Court justice. She came for something bigger, something personal to the people watching at home who didn't know the names of the cases but felt the weight of their consequences every day. She took a breath and spoke in a different rhythm now, slower, steadier, less courtroom, more living room. "There's a man in Odessa," she said, "named Jorge Salgado. Drives trucks, worked straight through the pandemic, didn't complain, didn't take a day off. But when his brother was detained in a private immigration facility and denied medical care, he filed a petition. The court denied it without even hearing the facts." She looked over at Roberts. He couldn't understand why. "So I told him, because the law was written that way, and the system makes it hard to challenge injustice when it's hiding behind language crafted to protect the powerful." She leaned in. "And the highest court in this country had a chance to fix that, but y'all refused to hear it." No explanation, no statement, nothing. Roberts didn't speak. Crockett continued. "These aren't hypotheticals, Chief Justice. These are people who still believe in the law, even when it betrays them, people who think if they work hard enough, play by the rules, someone at the top will care enough to hear them." She turned to the room now, not just to Roberts. "And we've got to ask ourselves, what happens when those people stop believing, when they stop thinking justice is possible for someone who doesn't own a company or fund a campaign or sit on a board?" There was a rawness in her voice, not anger, not performance, just truth. She paused for a moment before continuing. "I became a lawyer because I thought the law could be a tool for fairness. I stayed a lawyer because I learned the law is only as fair as the people who wield it. And today, I'm sitting across from someone who holds more power than most of us will ever touch but refuses to admit that power can go unchecked." Roberts finally responded, but his voice wasn't as firm. "Congresswoman, I don't dispute that some decisions have difficult consequences, but the role of the court is not to play savior. It is to interpret law as written." Crockett nodded. "And what happens when the law is written to serve a few, when it's interpreted to favor those already at the top?" She didn't need him to answer, she already knew he wouldn't. "You talk about judicial independence," she said, "but independence without accountability isn't strength. It's isolation." Someone in the back whispered, "She's right," not loud, not for drama, just one person saying what others were thinking. Crockett flipped one last paper over. "This isn't just about politics. It's about principle. It's about telling people like Jorge and Carla that their lives aren't invisible, that their stories don't stop mattering the moment they leave your courtroom." She looked around again. "Because the truth is, if this court won't hold itself accountable, it's up to the people, through us, to start asking louder, harder questions." The camera zoomed in on Roberts's face. His mouth was a straight line now, no smile, no mask, just silence. She looked at him once more. "I didn't come here today to humiliate you. I came here to remind you that justice isn't about titles. It's not about tradition. It's about people who still believe that somewhere, someone in power gives a damn." But she hadn't walked through fire just to make a speech. She had one final message to leave behind, and it was going to stick. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence didn't ask for permission, it just was. Reporters stopped typing, staffers quit pretending to shuffle papers, even members of the committee, some of whom had barely looked up earlier, now sat still, eyes on Crockett. Something had changed. Roberts felt it too. His posture remained tall, but his demeanor had softened. The old playbook, calm tone, legal jargon, measured distance, wasn't working, not today, not with her. Crockett slowly closed her folder and rested her hands on the table. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quiet, reflective. "You know, growing up in St. Louis, we had this old judge, white man, retired Army, hard as brick. But he used to say something I never forgot: a courtroom is only as honest as the people brave enough to challenge it. She glanced at Roberts. I think about that a lot these days. There was no applause, no drama, just gravity, like her words had been carved into the space. Roberts adjusted his chair but said nothing. His confidence hadn't collapsed, it had just been met, finally, by someone who didn't treat it like something sacred. Across the room, Representative Leonard Franks, a veteran from Arizona who rarely weighed in during these hearings, leaned toward his mic and muttered, "Damn. It wasn't policy, it wasn't debate, it was respect." And Crockett didn't even react. She wasn't here for praise. Chairman Bledsoe finally spoke, voice slower than usual. The committee thanks Representative Crockett for her line of questioning. Even he seemed cautious, like rushing to the next segment would break something delicate. Roberts reached for his water glass. His hand trembled, not enough for most to notice, but Crockett caught it. She looked him dead in the eye. "You don't have to agree with me, Chief Justice, but you heard me. That's all I came for." There was no malice in her voice, no bloating, just something much harder to dismiss: truth delivered without apology. One by one, other members began their questioning, but the energy had changed. The questions sounded less performative now, more focused. No one wanted to follow her, but they had to, and no one wanted to be seen as trying to clean up after what she'd just done. Even Roberts responded differently now, shorter answers, less theoretical, his tone clipped, his charm tucked away. He wasn't defensive, but he was aware. Now, fully outside the building, the hearing was already trending. Clips of Crockett's exchange were spreading across social media like wildfire. People who didn't care about Supreme Court procedures were now suddenly watching a full congressional clip with their lunch. In a coffee shop near the Capitol, a barista stopped mid-order to replay a line Crockett had delivered. In a classroom in Dallas, a young black girl asked her teacher, "Is she a lawyer?" And in homes across the country, people who had stopped trusting the system felt something they hadn't in a long time: representation that didn't look like compromise. Inside room 2141, Roberts finally looked at Crockett again, just for a second. But this time, there was no superiority, there was recognition, not of defeat, but of clarity. She wasn't some rising star, she wasn't the future, she was the now. But even as the room settled, there was one last thing she had to say, because this wasn't just about ethics or hearings, it was about legacy. The room had returned to its regular rhythm, at least on the surface, but anyone paying attention could feel the difference. What had begun as another carefully managed hearing was now marked, branded even, by a moment no one could rewind or talk over. Jasmine Crockett wasn't speaking anymore, but her presence hadn't faded. Her words still hung in the room like a law not yet written. She had done more than confront a Supreme Court justice. She'd made the entire machine blink. As the hearing continued and other representatives took their turns, Crockett sat quietly, listening, no smirks, no side comments, just stillness. She knew what had happened, she didn't need to say it again. About 30 minutes later, as the questioning wrapped, Chairman Bledsoe announced a short recess. Members stretched, staffers stood, a few journalists rushed out to file their pieces. Roberts stood, but before he could turn away from the table, he glanced back. Crockett didn't move. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice a touch lower, "your district is fortunate to have you." She looked up. "I know." He gave a small nod, less formality, more human this time, and turned to leave. He didn't look shaken anymore, just quieter. As the room emptied, one young woman from the gallery, a law student from Missouri dressed in a blazer 2 sizes too big, approached Crockett cautiously. "I just wanted to say," she began, "that I didn't think anyone ever spoke to them like that." "Not for real." Crockett stood and adjusted her sleeves. "Speak to them like what?" she asked. "Like they're not above you," the student said. Crockett smiled, not wide, not staged, just enough. "They're not." That was it. She picked up her notes and walked out of the hearing room without saying another word. Later that night, the exchange made its way onto national news, not just political shows but prime time. It wasn't the clash that got people's attention, it was how calm it had been, how deliberate, like Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she had taught a class. Commentators tried to frame it, some called it a challenge to the status quo, others said it was grandstanding. But those who watched the full thing, the ones who listened, not just reacted, felt something else: clarity. For years, people had been told the Supreme Court was sacred, beyond reach. But Crockett had shown, calmly and legally, that sacred things still need to be questioned, that power unchecked isn't order, it's erosion. And maybe, just maybe, a little discomfort in that hearing room was exactly what justice needed. Because the truth is, real change doesn't always roar in with banners and slogans. Sometimes it enters quietly, with one voice, a voice that doesn't flinch when someone powerful tries to shut it down. And if someone like Jasmine Crockett could sit across from the Chief Justice of the United States and speak truth, then maybe, just maybe, more people could do the same in their own lives, in their own towns, at their jobs, in their homes. That's the thing about moments like these: they don't just belong to the people in the room, they belong to us. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because there's more where this came from, and we're just getting started.